For those who don't know me, I'm Mark. I'm part of the Google team. I have to admit, I was a little bit hesitant about today's talk. I'm one of these people who thinks of computer gamers as these sort of teenage troglodytes who heroically contribute to the obesity crisis rather than sort of as deeply social people. But I'm here to be proved wrong, which is great. Welcome, of course, Tom Chatfield, who is here to prove me wrong. Tom's written this book, Fun Inc., and is going to tell us all about the social and business side of gaming. So please welcome him. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. I've written a book that covers all sorts of different aspects of gaming, that talks about the social aspects of gaming, that talks about the business aspects of gaming, that talks about even games in artistic terms. But I wanted to talk about something specific. And one of the things that I think is one of the most interesting key points and key ways of thinking about games in general, and video games in particular, which is games as learning engines, games as learning experiences. I've called it the fail epic, partly because I think one of the key aspects of games is the way that they transform our attitude towards failure and the idea of failure, and with that, the idea of success. I think there are really two key points about all games which underpin the fact that games have a history as old as civilization in the first place. Games in many ways precede civilization. And this is the fact that games touch on something very fundamental in us by being both concentrated kinds of experience and safe kinds of experience. So the quintessential games historically were to do with warfare and to do with social hierarchy. But these were safe, concentrated, repetitive ways of honing absolutely vital skills, but skills that would get you killed if you tried to practice them by just going out and doing them. So games offered this sort of concentrated environment and this structure of incentives and rewards to keep people doing these things and practicing, and getting better at these absolutely vital skills. And in many ways, computer games are an intensification of this, and the key things they offer compared to games in general are that the kind of feedback you get is far, far more rapid, and the kind of control you have over the experience and the data you get from it is far, far more precise than anything we've seen before. Starting off with a cheerful quote from Samuel Beckett, and this really is about the idea of recasting failure not as an absolute, you failed, therefore it's all over. It's about recasting failure as something that you do better, as a step on the way to success. And this, I think, gets at one of the key points about all games, which is transforming failure. And I think video games are doing this, as I said, in a particularly intense and remarkable way. Slightly different quote. I'm not quite sure what metric Woody Allen was using to arrive at his statistic, but I think he's hit on something there, that by far the most common form of failure is not trying. By far the most common form of failure is not being prepared to engage in a task in the first place because it's intimidating, because of the risk of censure, because if you're worried about how something will go, if the result is something that scares you, you're unlikely to brave it and take part. Now, talking about video games as learning engines, I'm not talking about taking video games and putting them into classrooms. It's not about using Spanish. It's not about saying that everyone in a history class ought to be playing Age of Empires in order to learn about history. I think that kind of argument misses the point, because what games are doing is showing us some very powerful underlying human principles about learning and about structures of learning. And what's been remarkable over the 50-odd years that computer games have existed is that they haven't stood still. They didn't just arrive in the world as addictive, compelling, fully formed activities. They began as one thing, and then because of commercial and social pressures, they have followed an incredibly rapid evolutionary curve next to their authors in terms of engaging people, in terms of incrementally improving the kind of engagement they offer. And I want to look at the underlying lessons that come from that. First of all, talk a little bit about traditional learning and training. Now, this is a bit of a cliche to say that traditional learning and training has stood still for sort of hundreds of years. It's certainly true that we have a very schizophrenic attitude towards play and towards play-like activities in learning. We absolutely accept that up to the age of sort of 5 or 6, the bulk of the way that people learn about the world around them is by sort of playful, unstructured, or game-like activities. And then suddenly we would do a switch. We insist that the hard work begins, and we begin what you could sum up as the rather sort of linear, straightforward process of learning. And there have been plenty of efforts to change this, to reform this, to introduce group work. A lot of these have been very effective, but they haven't really, I think, had underlying principles rooted in empirical study of what people are actually like. So I want to talk about a few of the sort of the cliched limitations of traditional attitudes towards learning and training. There we have a traditional learning scene, possibly. So the first thing is, few failures, they're not experimental. Now, I don't mean that people aren't failing. In fact, if you think of learning as being something that's truly tested by what it does for the weakest members of the group, and if you imagine a weak 6 or 7-year-old struggling to learn to read a passage, in fact, their experience of a traditional lesson is likely to be almost entirely composed of failure. There will probably be 3 or 4 decisive failures, at which point someone is very likely to give up. What it isn't is experimental, and what they're not being given is opportunities to fail in a positive way. They will simply try to stumble through a few sentences, stop, and really be able to go no further. There's no control they have over it. And it links to the second point, that there's a lot of censure associated with this kind of failure. There's pain not gained from these mistakes. When someone is confronted with the sheet they're supposed to be reading and the words don't make sense to them in the classroom, there is humiliation, there is frustration, there's a big turn-off. There's not really that much else. And the feedback is very slow. I think it's still true, especially for weaker people, that often when some people sit down to sit their GCSEs, this may be the first or second time they've ever actually sat in an exam, the feedback that they get takes a long time to come. It can seem very distant from what they're doing. It can seem very incomprehensible and threatening. And I think this applies just as much to a lot of training environments, implicitly or explicitly, that feedback is delivered in big, ugly, rather unpleasant lumps. And there's little personal investment. By that I mean that someone doesn't have much control over the process they're going through. If you imagine a person reading the textbook, it's a library full of books, it's dumped on your desk, work through it. You don't really have much of an option to choose anything during this process. You will submit to it, you may succeed, you may master it, you may not. But really, it puts an enormous onus on people teaching you and on your support structures, but and an enormous onus on your resourcefulness. But it's not something that you feel you can own in a sort of crucial way. And finally, there's a single path. And this is, I think, largely true of most conventional training and teaching, that there is one thing that you're doing at a time in front of you on the desk, the task going on. You may switch to another, but there's a single path to it, and with lots of people on the whole spectrum of abilities, it's almost a given that a lot of people will be let down by the one route on offer. And really connected to that, history and progress are unclear. So we've got our person sitting down in a classroom studying a piece of reading. Now, their teacher knows very well what the syllabus is and probably has a very good idea of where all their pupils sit on the spectrum of are they going to pass this exam at the end of the term. But they don't really know much about this at all. They have very, very little grasp, even the good ones, of where they need to be eventually, of how long along that path they are, and of where they've come from. There might be a few scattered results and grades, but really, and again, I'd say you get this in training environments as well, people don't often have a precise grip on where they need to be in the future in a month, in 2 months, in 3 months' time, or any sense of exactly how far at any moment, I'm here, I've done this, I've done that. And this leads to limited peer relationships, by which I mean people tend to be very aware of where they are in a hierarchy compared to people around them in a classroom. To be absolutely sure that by the age of 6 or 7, someone is quite aware of where they sit in the pecking order, of who is the top, of who is the middle, of who is the bottom. But you don't have much insight into the process that's going on with your colleagues, people in the classroom sitting around you, writing away. You have no sense of their method until it sort of pops out at the end. Your interactions with them, your relationship with them, tends to be limited to, if you like, competition and worry. Now, in the beginning, And this is what I was talking about with the trajectory of games. Because in the beginning, games were a bit like that. Yes, when computer games arrived, I suppose Space War is the first true video game. They were instantly much more exciting and accessible than pretty much anything that had ever happened on a computer before them in terms of sitting down and using them. At the same time, they were designed by experts for experts. They were designed largely by male geeks for other male geeks. Even Space Invaders, a very simple game in some ways, is very, very harsh. It's very, very unforgiving. It's frankly very, very difficult. You have to invest quite a lot in it to get anywhere. You die, you lose your lives, that's it. It's all over. You've got to start again. Asteroids is an absolute nightmare trying to get anywhere on that. These early games, they deserved their reputation as a niche activity for teenage boys who didn't much like the light, because they were so difficult in so many ways. Because in many ways, learning to master one of these games was a traditional learning experience. You had to work at it, and some people did. Some people invested hugely in it. But that's where they began. And if they just stayed there, this wouldn't be interesting. People said games are a fad for teenage boys. Like a fad, you get into them, it's a bit of a clique, and then you grow out of them, you hope. In fact, what happened is that games completely transformed themselves over 30, 40, 50 years. Completely and staggeringly transformed themselves. I think it's safe to say that electronic games are now the world's largest and fastest growing form of mass participation, and arguably the largest form of mass participation we've ever known in history. The word games expanded hugely to cover a vast spectrum of activities. But I think that there's something to do with learning that underlies almost all the games in the world at the moment, and that is something that has evolved through basically the work of trying to make more money, if you like, trying to get more people interested in them. You've got your Space Invaders, and a certain kind of person with a certain slightly fanatical bent will enjoy playing it and will try to get the high scores. But you're missing out on a huge section of the market. And over time, people have tried to bring in more and more different kinds of player. This obviously is a very nice flying mount from, I think it's a forthcoming flying mount actually. I think that's going to be in Cataclysm, so I don't think you can get those yet. But that's a very nice reward at the end game of World of Warcraft. And you probably know, to get to the end game of Warcraft, not many players achieve that, relatively about 12 million people playing the game worldwide. Very few of them will make it through to any really high-level raids. And yet, people keep playing. There are 12 million people playing this. And that's because, in many ways, the game has replaced the word fail with a rather different idea. And that is not yet succeeded. By which I mean that the idea of fail as something censorious, something dreadful, something that puts you off so that 80% of you don't turn up, as it were. 80% of the world wouldn't bother turning up to play a video game in the first place because it's so alienating. That's been replaced with the recognition that you can come up with things that different players will do. Richard Barthel, among others, has talked about 4 different player types, which covers pretty much the whole spectrum of human tendencies. People who want to explore, people who want to achieve, people who want to communicate, that sort of thing. But what we see, I think Warcraft is a good example because it's so good at combining all the lessons of games from the last 40, 50 years. So I want to talk through a little bit about what it does that is drawing and holding in so many different kinds of people and giving them the sense when they're playing that even though most of them are never going to make it into a raid, they're never going to get to Twin Blades, whatever, they're never going to get to the real high-end content, that doesn't feel like failure. In many ways, it's exciting for them that there are people who are doing that because they've got other stuff to do which they find rewarding. And the interesting thing is, that underpinning this, there we have one of the latest versions of this, the idea of achievements, which self-evidently suck in thousands and thousands of human hours around the world. But what we've got is the fact that everyone who's playing Warcraft is really training for one thing. They're training to control a character and click on a whole spectrum of different abilities and equip different items in order to make that little character kill stuff. That's all they're training to doing. We lose sight of that because there's such an incredibly elaborate network of things going on. When in fact people have been trained to do this one thing, and they've been trained to do it incredibly well. In terms of, imagine a driving test. Now, the kind of training you get from Warcraft is not like learning to drive a car. it's like learning to race an F1 race. The level of skill that people are attaining from what the game puts them through, the kind of training they voluntarily submit to, indeed that they pay for, gets people to an incredible level of sophistication and expertise. People are really very, very, very good at this game. Lots of them, even someone bad at this game, is very good at this game. It's incredibly good at getting people to put in hours of doing basically, which is hitting a ball with a sword. And it does this because it offers so many different ways to people of making their activity feel like an incremental success, an incremental rise. First of all, we've got character levels, at level 70 character at the top there. A little number that you make go up with an experience bar. Everything you do is contributing towards this number going up. It gives you a lovely sense of progress. At the same time, though, there's your reputation. You do stuff for different factions in the games, you get a bit of reputation here, you get a bit of reputation there. You're more welcome in the city, you get better prices in that city. At the same time, there's player versus player. If you want to, if you're on a PvP server, if you want to do some PvP, you can beat other people up and get different items, skills of that. At the same time, there's gear. There's this tantalizing random element. Every time you attack a mob, it's going to drop something, a percentage chance of it being really, really awesome. And this is an amazing hook. It was, Blizzard perfected this in the Diablo series of games and then imported it wholesale into Warcraft. And this is a very, very powerful incentive for people to just kill that next ball and see if it happens to drop a blue item. Achievements. As I said, this is possibly the pièce de résistance of the Warcraft world. By giving people an arbitrary task to do and then allowing them to wear a title that says, I've done that, I'm an explorer, I've been everywhere, you allow them to just do random stuff that wasn't anywhere else and wear it like a badge of pride in the community. And that, of course, is about social standing. It's the absolute crucial point that everybody's in this world together. You can look at each other. You are looking at each other all the time. And it's this that validates these achievements. It's this context that really gives them meaning and quite astonishing value to people. Because your peers see everything you do. And you, in turn, are excited by seeing the people at the top level, by seeing what could happen. There's customizations. You have an enormous and increasing amount of control over your avatar. And that means you really come to own it. If you're bored, you can just go and get a haircut. My wife is a doctor, and she's spent quite a amount of time in the game collecting an entire set of items with the moniker of a physician. So she can go around wearing a complete of a physician set. She's a healer. Yeah. In the game and in life. And there's many paths. And this is the crucial thing. You're thrown into this game, and it's the one game world, but it's a very big and flexible world. You can choose many different classes. You can have many different orgs. You can explore, and you're rewarded for doing each of these things. Everything is validated. Everything is a form of progress. You want to chat to people, you want to form a guild, you want to tag along at raids, fine. You want to go around causing grief, well, fine. If you want to go ganking people, that's okay, possibly. It adapts to people, and it never stands still. Of course, they've gathered a tremendous amount of data, something which I don't need to tell people here about. And this data is astonishingly powerful and this data, this information that's really been driving the industry forwards at what I'd say is a quantum speed, to have come from Space Invaders, bit, 20 nerdy men interested in getting high points, to something which can hold the attention for thousands of hours of 12 million people around the world, or something like Kart Rider in South Korea with 100 million users, or something like Zynga's casual games, with close to 200 million users. This is absolutely staggering. It's a staggering achievement in finding out what it is that gets people doing something and keeping doing it and wanting to improve. And it's, I think, what underlies it is taking all the things that would put them off and just boosting in their investment in making all sorts of different kinds of progress and taking ownership of that progress. What does all this mean then? How to talk generalities about Warcraft. And as I said at the start, it's not about putting Pac-Man into classrooms. It's not about saying, therefore, everyone in a Spanish class ought to play Warcraft. That would be absolute rubbish. It's about recognizing what the underlying principles are. First of all, this is where I think games show us a different way of thinking about people to traditional learning and training structures. Failure should be frequent, recurrent, recognized, and free of stigma. You should not be failing 3 or 4 times in an hour at your test and giving up. You should be not succeeding 20 times in the space of a minute and still having a bit of recognition for that, getting something for that, and just doing it again. I take a wonderful game on the PlayStation 3 called Flower by Genova Chen at that game company. And it's not a perfect game, but what it is, I think, is a wonderful way of recasting failure as something triumphant and personal, because you control it by moving the wind, by moving the controller around in the air. It blows a flower petal around, and you have to pick up other flower petals. And when you start playing this game, as some of you may know, it's almost impossible to control the thing. Your wind is blowing, and the flower petal, you can spend about 50 times trying to pick up other petals on the ground and swooping around with your control pad, and it's really very, very difficult. But you don't throw the controller across the room. You fail 50 times within the space of about 2 minutes, and then you pick up the first petal, and then you start to move, and then you start to do other stuff. And as a bit of spatial training, training someone, say, who has never interacted with a computer before, there are plenty of people like this in the world, just moving something around to control something beautiful on a screen is a very, very good way of lowering the barriers of entry, of teaching people how to access this electronic world. And the reason, I think, that people are unafraid to fail 50 times in 2 minutes in this game is that there is no stigma attached, that the experience is not punishing you for not yet succeeding. It's merely enticing you with graphics, with sounds. It uses principles of flow as well, so it adapts to your own way of doing things. And really, it's a completely different way of thinking about a problem and a skill set. It draws you on. Secondly, progress should be clear and cumulative, with multiple paths and show increments. What I'm talking about here is what I was saying about a person sitting in a classroom desperately trying to read through a passage with absolutely no idea what this means in the context of a GCSE or a term or even a lesson. Now, what you can do in games, for instance, to pick World of Warcraft again, first time you play the game, you've got all the numbers I was talking about, all your level and everything like that, and you are plonked in the middle of cities. Cities like Ogren, the Undercity, when you're surrounded by people who've been playing the game for thousands of hours, surrounded by amazing items. You can wander as a level 5 character into a level 55 area and look at the absolutely terrifying monsters in there. And people do this, and this is about knowing where you're going. The entire thing is laid out for you in tiny increments. You can see exactly where you'll be at level 55 or level 60 or level 65. You can see and start to appreciate what the end game loot will look like, what it might look like. And this is tremendously incentivizing. You can see exactly where you've come from. You can measure your progress on all of the criteria I listed, everything from level, reputation. You take ownership of all of them. You see precisely where you are on the scale. And this really gives people a tremendous sense, I think, of choosing where they want to be and of choosing to invest their activities. It's like, going back to the analogy of the school, someone in a maths class struggling to learn about differential equations, having free to access at any moment postgraduate level mathematics, imaginary numbers, all sorts of other highly advanced theories, and realizing from the very structure of the setup that what they're doing now, in their very basic way, is on a spectrum with these other amazing things. You see yourself in context, and that is enormously empowering for people to understand exactly how far they've progressed on the same measurable scale towards where they want to be and towards where they might be. Not everybody gets to the end game in Warcraft, but it's a great part of the game's appeal that you see where that end game is. Not everybody does a postgraduate degree in maths, but it's tremendously inspiring for someone struggling with a differential equation to understand on a measure as to where this fits in with the far larger world beyond that, to understand the whole spectrum of things and be able to contextualize their own activities and see their progress bit by bit. Finally, fairness and transparency. You know what everybody else is doing. And this is really about the fact of turning the social dynamic into something positive. So you have your classroom situation when nobody knows what's happened until the results of the test comes out, and then it's all backbiting and backstabbing. But if you can see in real time what everybody else is doing around you, if you can compare yourself to them, then you have options to collaborate, you have options to cooperate, you have options to learn from other people. And one of the interesting things about games is that people really don't mind things being hard in the long term. They don't mind the lofty, distant pinnacles being a long way away. If it's completely clear how they and everybody else are getting there. It's completely clear that the playing field is level, and it's completely clear what they need to do to get there. There's one very interesting innovation in our new Super Mario Brothers Wii. I don't know if anybody has played that, but it has a very nice feature called the Super Guide. And this is, if you fail a level 8 times in a row, quite a lot of times to fail it, then a little window pops up at the start and says, "Hi, you're having difficulty with this level. Would you like us to take you through it?" And if you say yes, you've got the option, then the computer takes over and controls your character and takes you through the level. And at any moment, you can interrupt that and take over again. But what this does, now you might think, putting this kind of thing in, it breaks a game. It renders it sort of pointless. Jump off a cliff 8 times, get the computer to do the level. In fact, it's had a tremendously positive response, and it's very, very well done. Because what it does is, it recognizes the point at which someone is about to give up and intervenes and offers them a route to take past it. Just knowing it's there is extraordinarily helpful. And having the option to take it up, it keeps people playing. It stops you from losing people. And this is the thing, I think, that as long as there isn't a silver bullet or a shortcut, as long as there's not something which negates effort, then really, the more mechanisms like this, the better. If it's fair for everybody, and everybody is aware what everybody else is doing, then supporting people to keep on the path, to keep engaged, is a certain good for learning environments. You don't want to lose people, and there are some very sophisticated ways about keeping people engaged and aware that the operation is fair. Really, why is all this exciting? And I think it's exciting because we are at the beginning of something. We look at how far and how fast games have come in 40 or 50 years. And not only games, of course. Of course, these are lessons which are being learned in terms of usability and access across all sorts of media. But I think it has happened more intensely and with more incredible focus in the world of games than anywhere else because of the unique way that games tap into us as learning creatures and because of the way that they allow us to rephrase failure as success. And I think if you look at what someone is doing when they sit down to use anything from a new piece of software to learning a new job, to trying to learn a new skill, to trying to get on somewhere, you can really start to explode the concept of learning into something far more than just imbibing data. You can take ownership of it. And these kind of techniques that I think underpin games allow people to be themselves differently. They allow people to be braver. They allow people to replace the fear and the uncertainty and the lack of engagement with the ability to make really bold moves, the ability to learn from each other, and the ability to take ownership of their progress. And I think, as I say, we're at the start of something, and I will be very excited indeed to see where it goes and where it ends. I was going to throw it open to questions at this point. I think it's probably more interesting to start talking earlier rather than later. Yes?
I was going to say, I definitely agree that it seems really natural that games would move away from a position of not being able to fail, because in real life there are very few examples of times when you just completely fail. Like generally that would be you ending up dead in real life. But I think there's another thing as well as not yet succeeding, which is also like a very human desire to beat other people. Like if you're playing on, say like Halo or something like that, you play that because like you want to defeat other people and show superiority over them. I don't think that's another kind of like equally important third point to like not yet succeeding.
Yeah, in terms of in addition to not yet succeeding, there's also, you mean, this drive to meet and compare yourself to other people as a key factor. Is that what you're?
I just mean that it's maybe not as simple as going from not failing to like not yet succeeding, but there's kind of a human instinct to succeed through defeating other people, which maybe fits kind of as an aside to that.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think absolutely that the social context is really what drives a lot of this, what gives it a point. In one sense, there's little point sort of. I mean, I think defeating other people is a very strong way of putting it, because I think that games have been very good at rephrasing that as another one of these ongoing tasks. So yes, you build up your frags in Quake, your kills in Halo, but you never decisively beat people. It never ends. You're engaged in a sort of constant incremental process of comparison. And this, I mean, you're absolutely right. This constant social development is what's really driving fastest growth areas of the games industry forward. I think I think with most games, comparing yourself to other people underpins it. But I think it's actually wrong to think about the most powerful thing as I beat you, now I'm better than you. In all games, we never want the competition to end. In a football league, you don't say, right, well, we found out who's the best at football. We don't need to play football anymore now. Let's do cricket. And then we've done cricket, and then we can do golf. And then we don't have to play these games anymore. We found out who's the best at golf. We like keeping track of these things over time. And interesting, the games in which there are no winners are ultra competitive, I think. You're partly competing with yourself and partly competing with other people. So if you take something like Farmville, the Facebook game, you're not killing anyone, you're not beating anything, but you are almost sort of fanatically trying to have a better and better and better little virtual pet, as it were. And the only criteria for better really is, first of all, a bit better than yourself and better than you were yesterday. But yes, better than your friends around you, better than your peers on Facebook. And so, although in Halo it happens that what you're doing in the game is shooting other people rather than watering your crops, you're not trying to vanquish them as an enemy. You're not trying to end the game. You're not trying to end the competition. It would be very boring if one of you was overpowered and could just win by breaking the rules. What you're trying to do is have this sort of rolling improvement and assessment validated by your relations with other people. Does that?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yes.
It seems clear that there's a bit of an invitation there to take some of the learnings that you've distilled out and apply them in another context. And it reminds me of Pat Kane's book, Play Ethic, where he talks about the same idea. And I think the name of Google gets sort of bandied around often in this debate as a company that applies these principles. But it also seems that when people talk about using that type of development, learning, ability to fail, it's often coupled with an example of here are all the companies that have tried it and failed, or imploded, or ditched this idea and taken on another. Have you seen any actual examples of this working in a context other than in Warcraft, where it clearly works, but in the real world? I mean, air traffic controllers don't have the ability to fail frequently without consequences. So how do we make this work?
Well, I think one of the simplest examples. I think across the world of training, it's not that you take a company and run the entire company along these lines. You can take training and run it along these lines. For instance, the military. If you look at the US military alone, is now spending $6 billion a year on games and game-like activities, and they set these things up. For instance, when you are using the first-person environment, America's Army, or when you're using various simulations to try and test anti-terrorism and population placation tactics, they use precisely this kind of setup to give people the chance not just to do a war game which ends in disaster, but to revisit their mistakes and their common errors again and again and again and again and try and iterate. In fact, they've just been coming up with a version of SimCity for Baghdad, I think, where people who are going out there are to be given this virtual toy to play with, to make lots of mistakes with, but in a context that allows them to try stuff, because that is the way that they learn. So you can, as it were, get people to admit to errors that they might otherwise conceal. You can have someone say, for instance, well, what happens if I just send out 20,000 troops onto the streets and shoot on sight? Why not? Let's see if that works. And you get people to try and do that. And because, A, the exercise is not incredibly expensive, because war games traditionally have been prohibitively, massively, hugely expensive. You want to drive a tank around, you want to fly a jet, it's going to cost you millions of dollars an hour. Whereas in this, you have a safe, repeatable environment. You can do that again and again and again and again and again. You can say, well, actually, troops on the streets, nobody likes me, and I get assassinated. Medicine is another great area of example for this. People are looking into virtual triage tools, for instance, where you can play out scenarios again and again, and you can, for instance, triage is about prioritizing casualties in order of treatment in a disaster zone. You can very accurately model the vital signs that you would get from people in a disaster area. You can try out all sorts of different sequences of treatment and allocation of resources and see which one works, again, without the censure of mistakes and without the vast expense that even doing active medical training with real doctors involves. And I think, as I say, that we're only just really beginning to see this. But I'm talking about training and education. And there's also, I suppose, the simple principle of usability testing. In a lot of software, a lot of people are finally starting to get their heads around the fact, I think, in some, even vast behemoth companies like Microsoft are finally starting to pay attention to the fact that certain versions of their products may be getting less and less usable, and they needed to pare them down and have fewer clicks. And I think what you might call a form of play testing is actually instrumental in arriving at these insights and knowing what best practice is. Is that useful? Yeah.
So as you know, in World of Warcraft and many other games, there are whole discipline of creating bots for these games. So the game plays itself effectively, and computer plays the game. And you brought up some interesting ideas about what could potentially be built into such bots to make them more effective, and what they should look out for them to work better. Just wondered if you could say more around kind of the bot or AI side of games and the learning implications for them.
So you're asking about the sort of the idea of automation of bots to play games and where AI comes into all this. I mean, I suppose it's certainly true that one way of rephrasing that question would be if you're able to take a situation and express that situation as a game situation with particular aims and rewards, that goes a long way towards telling you how to come up with an AI tool or an automated tool to try and solve this situation. And so I think there's a lot of two-way traffic that can go on between the idea of taking a complicated game environment and coming up with routines which are able to exploit that with maximum efficiency, and the idea of rephrasing, if you like, problems, digital problems or computational problems or real-world problems as game setups. I suppose I feel that we're very, very much at the really early days with AI. One of the interesting points, I mean, a lot of games over time have had artificial intelligences in them, some of which have been thought by players to be particularly fiendish, from Command and Conquer to Warcraft 3, that sort of people, I mean, those are not particularly fiendish. But the lesson has always been with those, thus far, I think, that actual functioning AIs haven't been terribly effective in games. That what has been effective is playtesting, is looking at what lots of people do, is just crunching very large amounts of data about what people are likely to do and putting in sort of pre-programmed behaviors that respond to known human aptitudes. So I suppose there's a bit of a conflict in game science, if you like, between the idea of trying to come up with first principles artificial intelligences which can respond to the game in a really effective manner, and the idea of measuring how lots of people play a game and come up with ways of responding to the way that people use this game. And so far, responding to people has proved, I think, a much more sort of fertile avenue, and using games to study human behaviour and then respond to that has proved much more fertile than, if you like, using games to study AI behaviour. I mean, even the most impressive bots aren't very impressive. I can't really think of any game-based AI that really deserves the name of AI. And I don't think we'll be seeing that for quite a while, actually, because I think that the observation of what people do, if you like, the use of cleverer observational crowdsourced tricks is really what is the sort of driving functional force at the moment.
You kind of touched on it a little bit, talking about AI. For example, Halo is generally regarded as one of the best AI games, or at least in my mind, because they seem to be smart, flanky, but their activities are very much constrained.
Yeah.
And this ties into what you were talking about before. So being able to simulate, say, Iraq, and being able to choose what you want to do, surely you're still going to be constrained by what the programmers have been able to think of. So you say, well, you can do anything. Maybe putting 20,000 troops on the street is effective, but can you actually do anything? And how far away are we from being able to have a real environment?
I mean, a game would be no good if it wasn't constrained. A game is about simplification. So yes, it's absolutely about the quality of your models. And there are, I guess, two things really that I think, in a sense, at the same point. It's about the quality of observation you can bring to bear. So the people playing a game are real, and they behave in very sort of real ways in a game setting. So on the one hand, you have the opportunity to observe how real people behave in far more complicated settings than almost any other kind of experiment I can think of. And on the other hand, you have the opportunity to measure the real world as accurately as you possibly can, and then try and put that data into a model. So, for instance, I suppose with something like, sort of SimCity Baghdad, you have to throw out the window all sorts of things that you might want to do because they're completely unfeasible. You have to try and get down to what the game actually can do. And I guess what it can do is not tell people what it's going to be like in Baghdad, but it can teach them a kind of thinking that will be useful to them in a city, in that situation. It can teach them what you might call system thinking, about the way that different variables in a system will interact in emergent and complex ways with each other. And this is a very, very important way of thinking for the 21st century. And it's a way that I think has to be learned. So in one sense, if they're trained to adjust variables minutely, if they're trained not to commit the fallacies of thinking that one sudden dramatic move can solve a problem, they're trained to look to multiple variables and to try and just think of the problem in front of them as a system, almost to try and come up with their own mental models of it, then that's where the real power lies. So games are absolutely about modelling, but done right. By putting a really good model in front of a real person, you teach them to model the world experimentally to themselves better, and you also teach them, I think, to try and see the people around you. It allows you to model the behaviours of the people around you, to find out things about people that you don't necessarily see in day-to-day life. You don't have the opportunity to observe people in these kind of almost experimental conditions. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you think that kind of the culture of like kind of carving out a niche in a game world and setting your own metrics of success, like you were talking about earlier, kind of progressive, like massive online games.
Yeah.
How does that gel with kind of the industry's desire to centralize them? So like Xbox Live wants everyone to have an account for all their games, or EA wants you to have an account for all of the things that you want. Do you think there's any kind of conflict of interest there?
I think there's I think there's potential conflicts of interest there. I mean, I think really we are going to see some big eruptions in the coming century between people's sort of investment in virtual property, which they actually have no ownership rights over, and the companies who claim total ownership over that kind of property. And I think you're getting to the stage already in some games. I mean, I guess EVE Online is the most complicated example of this, where it's reached a stage where there is an ongoing negotiation between the players and the people setting the rules. Because, I mean, it is rather a sort of paradoxical situation that people invest an awful lot of themselves into this and wish to exert sort of customizable control. But at the same time, the totality of this whole world is owned by a single corporate entity, which at any moment in the sort of term of use has the right to switch you off. Again, this is an issue that people here will be very familiar with in different terms. But I think the legal structures needed to deal with this are nascent, and I think the philosophical structures are nascent as well. I mean, interestingly, I think it's by looking to negotiations like those that have happened in games like EVE that we find some of the most interesting models for how this can take place. Because, for a start, these communities are totally transnational. The goods in them are virtual goods, but the people are real. It's a very interesting philosophical set of conundrums. And I'm not sure where it's all going to end, but I think it is going to blow up. I think there are going to be, I think there's already a couple of test cases going on in Asia about who has the rights of sort of ownership of virtual goods, virtual characters, virtual money. And players are beginning to assert that they have some rights, rather than just saying, well, actually, when push comes to shove, the company owns everything, and I have no ownership in the meaningful sense of this at all.
like to hear some practical examples of how we would apply the learnings that you presented to us to, let's say, the UK school system. In terms of achievements, grades don't seem to be enough, or credits.
Nice and easy question. Excellent.
You're welcome.
Let's just pick one example, progress bars. So, for instance, I see absolutely no reason why, why are achievements great? If achievements are being set by the company, you can do two things with achievements. You can push people out of their comfort zones, and these are in a sort of positive way. You're trying to reach a certain target. You're not being penalised. You can push people out of their comfort zones by saying, there's 50 different achievements you can get in your maths lesson. And one of these achievements is doing 10 differential equations showing you're working. One of these achievements is doing, sort of 25 definite integrations. You can take people out of their comfort zone, and also you can get people actually to do things and work out from that why what they're doing is worthwhile, rather than just saying this is a good thing to do. So you can say from them, for instance, well, I want you to, show your working while doing this, or do this in a particular way. And they will do that because they want to tick that particular box. And then in the process of doing that, they will come to a realization through doing, rather than just being told why this is a worthwhile thing to do. So what I might say is, at the moment, if you're talking about marking people, say people have very little ownership or sense of progress. So what about a system of each person having, if you like, a sort of avatar or electronic account where they have progress bars on a whole selection of different options for their class? They can see where they are, they can see where they want to be at the end, they can see what it would constitute to have ticked all the boxes to be someone who's ready to sit a GCSE. They can have all sorts of achievements along the way to keep them recorded. They can see their history. It's all on the same scale. They can see all of their colleagues and friends' separate scales. They can measure where they are. You can get side achievements for doing incidental things. You can get bonus achievements. You can go ahead and do more advanced work. You get credit for trying. You get credit for turning up. You get rewarded sort of constantly for doing things. You can customize it a bit because you've got 5 or 6 different things you do. So you might be the kind of person that says, right, I want to go straight for cubic equations, straight there. No, I'm not going to bother with quadratics. Yeah, go and do that. Fine. Somebody else might say, well, I want to do some linear equations. I just want to do 50 linear equations. But they get rewarded for doing that too. They've got everyone, you can adapt it to people, and people can participate in this. So just that use, for instance, of a more sophisticated, one would work out the details, but progress bars on the same scales, multiple achievements. I think this sort of thing would be very empowering for people, and also it would bringing digital media into the classroom is another good way of giving people ownership of the progress they're making. It has very positive connotations for people. It can be very well marked. It can save on admin. It can really be personalised. That would be one example.
Just an immediate reaction to that, I think it's very, very interesting. But to come back to the earlier question about bots on Warcraft, don't you automatically invite a generation of children to turn into education gold farmers by doing that? Just
Well,
write scripts.
I'd like to.
Make them geniuses.
But the thing is, aren't people? You would have to have a security system on this. You would have to try and make it immune to hacking. But for goodness sake, look how easy it is to cheat in the current educational setup. The current exam education setup is almost practically defunct in the case of advanced enough technology. I'm not saying I have a perfect solution, but I am saying in many ways it's an awful lot better than what we've got now. You read headlines recently about some high percentage of people cheating on mobile phones that we know about in exams. People, you could say now, better, it would be a good thing to turn someone not into a bot-driven gold farmer, but if someone really wants to sit there doing lots and lots of linear equations in order to push up their achievement score, that's kind of what you want out of a school. And the Nintendo brain training is not a perfect game, but it's a very good example of how some good design principles can really incentivize people, can make them want to do it more. And that's very much just a start, I think, because I think you need to step away from games. I don't want to create a brain training game for history. I think you need to look at the principles underlying it, which would be the ones I was trying to set out, some of those.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.